The last chapter of this, Ezra, feels like a tragedy has descended into a kind of farce, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you shaped that.
Uh, I think that's right, but I think I from the get-go, one of the things that I was interested in doing with the film was make sure I tell the story of what happened to OJ over the past 20 years, and where you really can sort of bring together the strands of all of these things historically, sorry, politically, historically, culturally, but most importantly, sort of so for me, like, how he was able to go on day to day. What was the sort of, how did the world absorb him? But it wasn't really until I saw the footage that we were able to get, where you saw people on a day-to-day basis coming up to him and wanting his autograph, wanting to shake his hand, wanting to give him a hug, that I got a sense of the true power of celebrity in our culture, and the idea that here's a guy who, just by dint of, yes, his previous fame, but his infamy and being on television every day during that trial, how much that sort of has an effect on people just wanting to and giving validation to him as someone in the world. It is farcical, and in terms of his descent beyond that into a place, because where are you supposed to go after you've been through that episode? And so for me, that whole chapter, the last chapter, is really was one of the things that made this worthwhile to pursue.
Give us a sense of how long this project took. I mean, there are people who make a 90-minute film, and it can take them a year or two. Give us a scope of how this project took, and how do you think it was, how did it compare to making, in the past you've made some hour-long, maybe 90-minute documentaries, sports documentaries for HBO and ESPN. What was the difference between moving from that scale to this scale?
It was just much more immersive. We did the whole thing in 2 years. And so, yeah, instead of doing something that's 90 minutes long, we did something that's almost 8 hours long. And it was very all-consuming. The process itself was kind of no different. Everything is it's sort of magnified with the amount of people that you're trying to, the story you're trying to sort of keep straight in your head, the people that you're engaging with in the world, literally the 3 editors that you're engaging with on a daily basis when you get to that point of post-production. So everything it's the same process, but you're sort of constantly trying to, corral more stuff and keep everything within sort of a realistic place, so you can, and so and the main thing is just not getting overwhelmed, and sort of at any point saying, oh, I'm making this 8-hour thing. I'm working on this 5-minute part of this thing today, and so that's the only way to sort of do it and keep staying.
It's like climbing a mountain. You only worry about like the next foot, not the.
That's correct.
So you interviewed an incredible cast of real life characters. I know when you went into these interviews, you had researched them as much as possible. You and I talked on my podcast, Pure Nonfiction. You told me that you read all the books there was to read on OJ, and of course, by the time you did some interviews, you had interviewed other people. So, can you describe, in doing an interview, how much of the process is trying to get out from them what you already know, and how much is trying to dig for something that you don't know, to leave yourself open to surprise, and are there any examples of those surprises?
It's both. I think with a lot of people in this film specifically, you're dealing with people who, by and large, did not want to be in the film. And so, having said that, once they agreed to sit down to participate, I think they were comfortable enough and felt that they got to the point where, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to talk. And so by and large, I'm going to answer your question, by and large, there's maybe the most general overarching surprise of the process was that people were much more forthcoming than I thought they would be. It wasn't difficult to get people to discuss these things once they were in a chair, save for 2 or 3 people. But I don't think with something of this scope, if you did not have a plan, the interviews wouldn't go very far. Just however long they were taking, I still sort of had a very clear understanding of what I wanted to talk to them about. Having said that, I also, because this is a film that's about the city of Los Angeles and everyone's a part of this tapestry, you know, I was sort of very open to who they are, where they're from, and depending on who they are vis-a-vis thematically what we're talking about in the story, you know, if it's Zoe Tor, who is the, you know, transgender helicopter pilot, talking about growing up in Brentwood, I don't know what she has to say about her experience in Brentwood, but I know I'm going to ask her about that. And it's no different than Mike Albanese, who's the SWAT commander, who I knew was, you know, in the LAPD for 33 years. And so while I'm there specifically to talk to him about being in charge of trying to talk OJ out of the Bronco that day on June 17, 1994, because of the scope of the story, I'm interested in his perspective, you know, being a white cop on this police force and being a native Angelino, to understand what his connection to all these events previously were. And that's where I didn't know what I was getting. And you sort of put something out there, and sometimes what you get is surprising. In the case of Mike Albanese, it was, oh yeah, during the riots, I was the first person, I went up in a helicopter and I was shot down. I'm like, oh, you know, over Florence and Normandy. And so you get these anecdotes here and there, be it like that, or a Ron Shipp, who is such a key character in the film, and whereas I knew I'd be talking to him about being a cop and the, you know, sort of becoming friends with OJ, insofar as, you know, that's an embodiment of the chumminess that OJ enjoyed with the LAPD, and I knew that he was the guy who ultimately testified against him in the trial. That's why I was sitting down talking to him. What I didn't understand completely was that, oh, he was a teenager who came of age during a time when OJ was at SC, and he went to that UCLA-USC game and snuck in. And oh, he went to a banquet that OJ was talking at, and OJ name-checked him, things like that I didn't know. And so when you're sitting there doing these interviews, you are realizing very quickly that someone like that is going to be a much more integrated character in the whole story, and really is someone who is an embodiment of that hero worship that we all have for whoever that person may be that we're worshiping. But in his case, he was really, you know, sort of blown away and, you know, fixated on OJ from a young age. And so there's a lot of things like that that happen that, you know, as you're going and talking to these people, it quickly became apparent that there was a richer story to be told.
Now, when I interviewed you for Pure Nonfiction, it was before the film had aired on ESPN, so it hadn't been widely seen or processed yet. I'm curious now that it has been widely seen and processed, how some of the people have reacted. Have you heard from Mark Furman or anyone else how having this story out in the public has affected them?
We've heard, I mean, I would say the collective we, everyone who's worked on the film. I wasn't necessarily the person who was in communication with everyone as far as phone and email. I think we've probably, you know, there's 72 people we interviewed, we've probably heard from 2/3 of them. And most people, by and large, have been very, I think, you know, they've liked what they've seen. I mean, like, I've gotten some emails that were like Tom Lang, who is the detective in the case, sent me a very matter-of-fact page email, being like, here are my thoughts. And I was like, okay. And they, you know, it was fair. It was down the middle. Things that, you know, here's the thing. I think he got to say what he wanted to say. And I think in the end, what, you know, when we went and had conversations with these people and said, this is what we're doing, you know, it's not this story that's a regurgitation of the case or the trial. It is a much bigger, longer treatment. This is an historical document. This is going to be, you know, everyone's perspective is going to be heard. I am not sort of, there's no agenda that I'm putting forth. That I think what we ended up being able to do was consistent, you know, with the message that we offer these people. So I think by and large, when they saw it, they said, yeah, this is great. And it really was beyond what most people who have done things about OJ have done. So I think they appreciated that it was much greater in scope in the end than sort of what they had been used to. And so by and large, everyone's been very positive.
All right, let me open this up to questions. Yeah, right here.
2 shorter questions. Who do you think lied the
Talk a little
most?
louder.
Who do you think,
We'll repeat the questions.
who do you
if,
think lied the most or was least honest of the people you interviewed that we saw in the film?
So the question is, who do you think lied the most of who we saw in the film?
Who lied the most that we saw in the film or that I interviewed?
Yes, no, that we saw.
I was gonna say,
that we
I was
saw.
gonna go with the first question, who lied the most that we saw in the film, that'd be OJ. Who that I interviewed? I don't mean to be this to be a cop-out. I don't know that anybody lied.
Well, during the break, some people were talking about Furman being a big liar. Now, is that?
Well,
not
here's the thing.
accurate?
Okay, but I mean, I would take that and to parse it and go, okay, so what did he lie about? Because in terms of what he was directly confronted about, for instance, when I asked him about whether his, sort of his viewpoints, his views, or his worldview was reflected in sort of what was on those tapes, and you notice that he didn't answer the question.
Right.
He said I was fair on the streets, so he didn't lie. He just went a different way.
Yeah.
And so like so I would say it was I would sort of answer the question to be like the people who were least forthcoming versus the people who lied the most. I would say Furman. I would say there's a lawyer that you guys could probably, having just seen the movie, can take a stab at who was less forthcoming than others, who just out of respect I'll leave his name out of it, who seemed to be a little bit more uncomfortable sitting in a chair than the rest of them. Those are the two people that come to mind. Am I missing someone? I mean, look, the other person who clearly is harder to get your head around is Mike Gilbert, who is his agent, who is his purpose in the film. He is a little bit of a shady character, and there is a sort of the memorabilia that you're like, he both was that close to OJ, he both was sort of very emotionally sort of taken through, this sort of got into a weird place himself. But he's a guy who stuck by OJ for all those years after even the murders, and so you wonder what he really is saying and how forthcoming he's being. Though I believed in the course of that interview, that was the longest interview we did with anybody. I do believe that.
And how long was that, when you say longest?
That was 6.5 hours.
In one sitting, one day, or?
That was one day. We had 2 breaks. It was like you guys watching the movie today. So that was, so he, the people that you would sense would be the people that I would.
Yeah. And the other quick question is, do you know why there was such bad blood amongst the OJ's lawyers? Because we in what we saw in the film, we couldn't see any of that, obviously, but they sounded like they all hated each other.
Yeah, he asked why there was such bad blood amongst the defense team and the lawyers. Well, first thing, there's a word, it's 3 letters, it's called ego. And they were a wonderful collection of egomaniacs that were all stuffed in a room together, and they all wanted to puff their chest out and be the man. And so Robert Shapiro, who was initially hired to be his lawyer, he kind of was usurped by Johnny Cochran. And there's a scene in the movie that we took out that was literally about that, and sort of and Shapiro being marginalized, and OJ basically saying to him like, Johnny's gonna now sort of take charge. And so I think that's what it was. I think there was a lot of different agendas, and sort of, if you're talking about someone like Shapiro, he's going to go back to his practice in West LA and have to go out and deal with people who, by and large, believed OJ was innocent. And so his reaction to the verdict, I think genuinely both was of surprise, but I also think it was purely self-protection in terms of what he was going to have to do going forth. So there's sort of things that are explainable, and in terms of, but the main reason would be ego.
Question at the top?
Thank you for that film. It was quite a long ride and ups and downs, but it didn't drag for me. So I have a bunch of questions. First was, I didn't catch if the Vegas jury, what the racial makeup was of the Vegas jury. It seemed like
it was a predominantly white jury.
Okay, that's kind of what I assumed. I just wasn't sure. And then I was wondering if you know of, in terms of the LAPD's reaction to the OJ verdict, if they took that and it, did it increase bitterness in terms of police community relations after the verdict? Did they change anything in their practices accordingly, or did it maybe help police relations?
I don't know if relations, it sort of did help in terms of the way crime scenes were handled. So there was some sort of positive response to sort of the way that the LAPD handled OJ, that crime scene specifically. That was improved later on in terms of just, being a little bit more buttoned up, and how evidence is handled. As far as the sort of community relations, I mean, it's a good question. It's not as if, again, the Rampart scandal happened 2 years after the verdict. And so, this is an ongoing discussion in terms of how this was transformational. I think that this is part of this continuum that had to do with Rodney King and had to do with Ramparts, where now I think we have gotten to a place that I think, considering the conversations that we've been having about policing in America over the past few years, that LA sort of strangely has evolved a little bit more than some police departments. How much it has to do with this case and the handling of it, I can't tell you.
Right here.
Tubin, who of course was a wonderful observer, I get the impression he was actually he was the one who first talked about Furman to the defense team. Was he a part of the defense team or just?
No, he was just a nosy journalist.
Just a journalist?
Yeah, he was just trying to write a story. He showed up, he was sent out by the New Yorker to write a story about this thing.
He didn't write that New Yorker article?
He did.
Oh, that was a Tubin article, okay.
That was him.
got it.
So yeah,
All right,
that was
I got
literally
it.
his role. He was out there without a
All right.
plan, trying to do this, and he got a tip from Shapiro. He sort of found that on his own.
Got it.
Woman up top.
Hi, excellent film. I just have a question about the archive. It seems like, there have been so many iterations of the OJ story, and this sort of hits points that I'd never seen before. But in terms of the archive, can you speak to particularly the crime scene, things like the cold journals, hearing OJ's voice in the 911 call? Did the benefit of distance get you those type of materials, or were they around in the moment and you just assembled?
It's a good question. I'm sure a little bit, to use those three examples. I think the 911 calls would have been accessible whenever anybody chose to do something. The crime scene photos specifically we got from Bill Hodgman, who is the deputy DA, and he's someone that frankly doesn't deal with the media and talking about this story, and so that was a long process just to get him to talk to us, let alone getting him to sit in a chair. But he, and those photos came from, he gives a presentation still to this day to law enforcement about the crime and about that crime scene. And so he, as part of the process, once he finally decided to just talk to us off the record, and so we had a conversation with him, then he brought us back a couple weeks later, and to Tamara, one of our producers, and myself, and he gave us that presentation. At the end of the presentation are those photos that I'd never seen before. So I wouldn't have even known that they existed or were accessible until I saw them, and it said, "Oh, are these things?" And so he gave them to us, and so that's how that. And I don't know if that's about the distance or sort of him trusting us, or if someone actually had done or able to do research in a certain way to understand where those things were and how you got them. But I think the distance helped in general. Certainly with the subject. And as far as the archival, you have just sort of things that have been floating around with varying levels of propriety in terms of who owns what. And so I think that we hit it at the right time. Not everything was easy to get, and there was a lot of sort of wrangling that went on. But look, I think this story would have been easier to tell 10 years from now, but I think it would have been impossible to tell 10 years ago. So, I don't know.
Yes, in the blue.
During one of the intermissions, there were a couple of quick questions, and I wanted to ask you something else. But so one question was, when in the courtroom, was there any testimony and pictures allowed of the wife beating in earlier incidents before the murder? We weren't clear about that. And then when you would show, they would talk. Somebody in the show was saying when the cameras were on OJ, he would be looking one way, and then when the cameras were off, he would look a different way. And were those? There was a question about whether they were his the pictures of his face, were they spliced in as we're hearing testimony, or as we're hearing the, whatever,
Yeah.
the overlay, or was that like in real time? And then the other question I had is, like, how old were you when you heard of OJ? What did he mean in your life? Did he mean anything in your life? How did you end up doing this, you know?
So this
I'm
is
sorry,
a complex
that's an old
question. Okay, so I'm gonna answer so there's one camera in the courtroom. And so in terms of like how the thing was absorbed by anybody watching it, you're getting the image that the world shows you. So insofar as you hear Marcia Clark saying that OJ, when the camera was on him, looked a certain way and the camera was off, his face fell, that's sort of just a reflection of, so literally we're showing an image of when the camera's on him. I don't know, that's a general scene about OJ and the media at that point. It's not specific to when the camera is on him. So as far as the testimony about other domestic violence incidents, here's the thing, it's all hearsay. And so what's in a diary is there's no testimony, there's no first person testimony about, so the things that were admissible were very little in terms of other incidents, because frankly other incidents had never been really known to the public.
And do you think, this is actually a different question, do you think it would have made a difference, or?
No.
No.
I don't. I think clearly there was a point of demarcation that said again, what Yolanda Crawford, who was the younger woman, the juror, sort of says he abused Nicole, he's a terrible person, I felt for her, doesn't mean I think he's guilty of murder, or it doesn't mean I'm gonna ignore all the other things that are happening in the case.
Yeah.
So I don't know that further testimony, she was convinced that he abused her.
Yeah.
So in that way, the point was gotten across. As you can see from Carrie Best, I don't think she cared one or the other.
Yeah.
So whether it would have made more of a difference if there was more testimony about that, I don't know. As far as me, when I got to know, I've been known OJ since I could, I was conscious. So I have to tell, if you walked right now into my parents' house in Washington DC and you walked up the staircase to the second floor of our house, there are a bunch of childhood photos of my brothers and I. And there's a photo of my two brothers, and one's wearing a Lynn Swann jersey and one's wearing an OJ jersey. And that was in my house my entire life. And so OJ's always been in my consciousness. And I watched him on TV. I'm just old enough to have sort of, I wasn't old enough to watch him during his heyday as a football player, but the highlights of him as a football player were part of my childhood. And so I would watch him on TV during the Hertz commercials, and when I was in an airport, I would imitate him running through, I'd be dodging people, and I'm OJ. And so OJ was that guy for me. And so he was someone that I connected to as a young person. And so I was like a lot of other people who stood in shock at the notion that he was, stood accused of murder. And so in that way, I had a sort of I had a relationship consistent with a lot of Americans before the trial, and it's also why I really took pains to make sure, you saw who he was and how beautiful he was and how talented he was and how he seduced us as a culture, because that's so important to understanding why we all were so confused by this happening in 1994. Did I miss anything?
I don't think so. And I just want to say, I just think it's an amazing thing, and I can't even imagine how you make something like this, just from the beginning, having an idea and then the product, it's just astounding to me, so.
Thank you.
Just applaud you.
I did have a small army of production staff, but with 3 incredible producers, Caroline Waterlow, Tamara Rosenberg, and Nina Christic, all of whom sort of did different things. 3 editors who were incredible. We all worked really hard. And everyone sort of proactively did different things, and this was an incredibly unfun thing to do, but it somehow got done. But it really takes sort of, a group of people who are all sort of committed with their individual in their areas to sort of constantly be sort of working and meeting and sort of massaging and getting the thing to the point where it needs to get. So in retrospect, it seems like a short time, but it sort of feels like my brain got erased from sort of just what that process was, but somehow we got it done.
Well, as you may know, this film at Doc NYC is part of our short list of 15 films of this year that we think are some of the most interesting films that we expect to be talked about going into the award season. For a 7.5-hour film, it's not many people who can really experience it on the big screen in the way that you have. So I really commend you for making the time to do it, and we're really pleased to have Ezra Edelman join us. So thank you very much, and thanks to Ezra Edelman.